Hello everyone. Welcome to another episode of horror stories that you can listen to while you fall asleep. Before the video begins, let us know what time is it and where you are listening from. Also, if you have suggestion for next horror story settings, let us know in the comments. Now let's begin. The thing about fear is, it doesn't always come in a flash. Sometimes it builds. It seeps into your life like a slow-moving flood, and by the time you realize you're drowning, it's already too late. I'm telling you this now because I need someone to know. I need to get it out before it consumes me completely. Before I become just another headline, another unsolved mystery. It started with a job, a simple summer job. I was a student trying to save up for my final year of college. The ad in the local paper was for a caretaker of an old estate on the outskirts of town. The pay was good, the hours were flexible, and the listing promised a quiet, solitary environment. Perfect for someone like me, who preferred the company of books to people. The place was called Blackwood Manor. It stood on a sprawling piece of land, surrounded by thick, oppressive woods that seemed to hold their breath in the humid summer air. The main house was a grand, Gothic structure, all dark stone and intricate ironwork, with a roof that sagged in the middle like a weary sigh. The owner, an old man named Mr. Abernathy, lived in a small, modern cottage on the property. He was frail, with hands that trembled and eyes that held the tired, distant look of someone who had seen too much. He told me the house had been in his family for generations. "It's a beautiful house," he said, his voice a raspy whisper. "But it's got a long memory." He didn't elaborate, and I didn't press him. I just needed the money. My duties were simple: mow the lawns, weed the gardens, and keep the main house aired out. That last one was the strangest. Every day, I had to walk through the house, opening all the windows and doors, letting the stale air escape and the sunlight pour in. The first time I stepped inside, the smell hit me like a physical force. It was the scent of decay and old wood, but with a strange, sweet undertone that made my stomach churn. The house was a museum of a bygone era. Dust sheets covered the furniture, and the air was so heavy with silence it felt like it could soften a scream. For the first few weeks, it was fine. I'd spend a couple of hours each day in the house, a portable speaker blasting some upbeat music to chase away the silence. But then things began to change. Small things at first. Things I could easily dismiss as coincidence. The windows I'd opened in the morning would be closed when I returned in the afternoon. A chair I'd moved to dust would be back in its original spot. I'd find books I hadn't touched on the floor, their pages open to strange, incomprehensible passages. I mentioned it to Mr. Abernathy, who just smiled a sad, knowing smile. "The house is old," he said. "It settles." But the unsettling feeling wasn't just in the house. It followed me home. I'd be sitting in my apartment miles away, and I'd swear I could still smell that sweet, cloying odor of the manor. I'd hear the faint creak of floorboards, the whisper of a breeze where there was no breeze. My sleep became a fractured, anxious thing, filled with nightmares of long, shadowy hallways and the sound of someone humming an old, forgotten tune. The real fear began the day I found the photographs. They were in a small, leather-bound box in a study I hadn't yet explored. The photos were all of a young woman. She was beautiful, with a cascade of dark hair and a smile that seemed to shimmer with light. She was always in the same place, Blackwood Manor. In one photo, she was on the porch, a mischievous glint in her eyes. In another, she was in the rose garden, her arms full of blossoms. I felt a pang of sadness. She looked so happy, so alive. I wondered what had happened to her. A few days later, I was cleaning the attic. The air up there was hot and thick, and motes of dust danced in the single beam of light filtering through a grimy window. I was moving a stack of old trunks when I saw it. Tucked behind a large, moth-eaten tapestry was a small, crudely carved wooden bird. It was a raven, with its wings spread in flight. I picked it up, and the wood felt cool and smooth under my fingertips. Something about it felt wrong, like a secret had been carved into the grain. I put it in my pocket and finished my work. That night, the nightmares came back with a vengeance. I was in the manor, but it was different. The furniture was gone, the walls were bare. The air was a tangible, suffocating weight. I was being followed. I could hear it. The soft drag of a footstep, the faint click of a door closing behind me. And then I heard the humming. That same old, forgotten tune I'd heard in my waking hours. It was coming from the shadows, and it was getting closer. I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart hammering against my ribs. I looked at the clock. It was 3 a.m., and then I felt it, a faint, sweet smell like old flowers, the smell of Blackwood Manor. It was in my room. The next day, I went back to the house, my heart a leaden weight in my chest. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had crossed a line. I walked through the house, trying to find a logical explanation for everything. The windows, the books, the smells. I was on the second floor when I saw it. A single dark feather, lying on the dusty floorboards in the hallway. I knew with a bone-deep certainty that it was from a raven. I felt a sudden, urgent need to talk to Mr. Abernathy. To ask him about the girl in the photos, about the humming, about the raven. I found him in his cottage, sitting in his armchair, staring out the window at the woods. I told him everything. The shifting objects, the smells, the nightmares, the feather. I pulled the wooden bird from my pocket and showed it to him. His hands started to tremble, and a look of deep, profound sadness washed over his face. That was my sister's," he whispered. "She carved it herself. She loved birds, especially ravens." "Who is she?" I asked, a lump forming in my throat. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a terrifying mix of grief and pity. "Her name was Eleanor. She was the one in the photographs. She went missing over 50 years ago. Never found a trace of her. Everyone said she just ran away." I felt a wave of cold rush over me, but it wasn't fear yet. It was confusion. "But what about?" I started to ask, but he cut me off. "The police came. They searched the house, the woods. Nothing. My father, he loved her. He never gave up hope. He'd walk the grounds every night, calling her name. He said he could hear her humming sometimes. But he never found her. He just kept saying, 'The house has a long memory.'" He looked at the raven in my hand, and his gaze seemed to pierce right through me. "She never left the house. She's still there. But she's not the Eleanor you see in the pictures. She's not the girl who smiled at the camera. She's the one who's afraid to leave. And now she's not alone. It's not the house that has a long memory. It's what's inside." I didn't understand. What did he mean? What's inside? What was he talking about? I pressed him, but he wouldn't say another word. He just sat there, shaking, his eyes fixed on the house. I left, confused and terrified. I went home and spent the next few days in a daze, the dread building in my gut. I couldn't go back to Blackwood Manor. I just couldn't. I called Mr. Abernathy and told him I was quitting. He didn't argue. He just said, "Be careful." The nightmares, however, didn't stop. They got worse. The humming became louder, clearer. I could hear whispers in the shadows, and I'd wake up to the distinct, sweet smell of the manor. One night, I dreamed I was back in the attic. I was looking at the tapestry, the one I had moved, and behind it, in the dream, I saw a small, dark opening. A hidden passage. I woke up in a cold sweat, my body trembling. I knew I had to go back. I had to know. I drove to the manor in the dead of night, a flashlight in my hand and a baseball bat in the trunk. The house was a black silhouette against the moonless sky, and it felt like it was watching me. I found the attic door and, with a trembling hand, pushed it open. I walked to the tapestry, and just as in my dream, I pulled it aside. There it was, a small, narrow passage, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. The air coming from it was thick with the scent of decay. I hesitated, my heart pounding in my ears. I knew I should turn back, but the curiosity, the morbid need to know, was a gnawing ache in my gut. I shined my flashlight into the darkness. The passage led to a small, hidden room. The air in there was suffocating, and the smell was almost unbearable. My flashlight beam danced across the walls, revealing a horrifying sight. The walls were covered in crude, red scrawlings. Drawings of stick figures, a circle of them, holding hands. But this time they weren't smiling. Their faces were twisted into expressions of terror. In the middle of the circle, a figure lay on the ground, but it wasn't just a stick figure. It was a detailed drawing of a young woman, her face a mask of agony. And written below it, in that same dark red substance, was a single word, over and over again. Trapped. 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 I backed out of the room, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. My flashlight beam landed on the floor of the passage. And there, I saw something that made me scream. It was a single, tiny, tarnished brass button, the kind you'd see on an old-fashioned coat. My flashlight beam flickered, and for a split second, I saw something else. Something on the wall, in the shadows, right next to where I had been standing. A name scrawled in the same dark red. It was a name I recognized. My own. I ran. I ran faster than I ever had in my life. I got in my car and sped away, the tires kicking up a cloud of dust. But as I drove, I couldn't shake the image of that name, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was not alone. The house wasn't just old. It was a predator, and it had found a new prey. I never looked back, and I never went near that place again. But the humming never stopped. It's in my head, a constant low thrum, and sometimes late at night, I swear I can hear a faint whisper from the shadows, a voice that sounds both old and young, saying, "Be careful. Be careful. The house has a long memory. And now you're part of it." The thing you have to understand is how small it starts. Not with a bang, but with a whisper. A simple, too good to be true job posting on a local university bulletin board. House sitter needed for isolated estate. Long term. Excellent pay. I was in the middle of a miserable summer, broke and directionless, and that ad felt like a lifeline. I made the call, and the voice on the other end was like dried leaves rustling, thin, ancient, and brittle. She was a Mrs. Eleanor Vance, and she lived in a sprawling, anachronistic house on the other side of the county, nestled deep in the woods, miles from the nearest town. She wanted someone to stay in her home for 3 months while she was away on business. The first time I saw it, I felt a knot of unease tighten in my stomach. The house wasn't just old, it was petrified. It stood on a perfectly manicured lawn, a pale, sterile monument surrounded by the wild chaos of the forest. The windows, all polished and spotless, were like blank eyes. Mrs. Vance, a wisp of a woman with a face like crumpled parchment and a spine as straight as a ruler, greeted me at the door. Her hands were thin and cool to the touch. She didn't shake my hand. She simply let her fingers brush against mine for a brief, unsettling second. The inside was even more unnerving. It was a museum of her life, and it was flawless. Every book on the shelf was aligned by size, every antique teacup arranged with mathematical precision. There was no dust, not a single mote. The air was still and smelled faintly of lavender and something else I couldn't place, something sterile and metallic. She gave me a tour, speaking in a low, unwavering voice. "I want you to keep everything exactly as it is," she said, her eyes, dark and unblinking, fixed on me. "Nothing is to be moved. Nothing is to be altered. This house is a memory, and it must be preserved." Her most important rule was about the basement and the attic. "They are not part of the house," she said. "They are for storage. Stay out of them." I nodded, not questioning it. The pay was enough to buy a dozen mysteries. I was fine with staying out of the basement and attic. For the first few days, the job was a dream. I read on the porch, a soft breeze carrying the scent of pine. The silence was deep, but not peaceful. It was a silence that felt like it was listening. That's when the small things started. I'd be reading in the sitting room, and I'd put my teacup down on the coffee table. When I'd look up a few minutes later, it would be a few inches to the left of where I'd placed it. I'd be walking down the long, carpeted hallway, and a photograph on the wall would be ever so slightly crooked. I'd straighten it, but when I passed by again an hour later, it would be crooked once more. These were minor things easily dismissed. The house settling, my own forgetfulness, the power of suggestion. But then they got more personal. I'd wake up in the morning, and the t-shirt I'd left crumpled on the chair would be neatly folded. A book I was reading would be closed, a bookmark carefully placed a few pages back from where I'd left off. I started to feel an oppressive presence, as if I were being watched. I began to talk to myself out loud, just to break the suffocating silence. "It's just the wind," I'd say to the empty room when I heard a faint scratching from the other side of a wall. "It's just the old pipes," I'd whisper when I heard a faint, rhythmic tapping from the floor above. My sleep became a fractured, anxious thing. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, my heart thudding, convinced I wasn't alone. The house was a labyrinth of shadows at night, and every creak of the floorboards was a footstep, every gust of wind a sigh right outside my bedroom door. I began to notice things I hadn't before. The photographs on the walls, for example. They were all of the same person, a young man, but the photos were strange. They were all taken from a distance. The man was walking down a street, looking into a store window, sitting on a park bench. He never seemed to know he was being photographed. It was like a collection of moments stolen from afar. It was voyeuristic, chilling. I was in the master bedroom, trying to find a box of spare light bulbs, when I came across a small, leather-bound journal in a nightstand drawer. It was filled with Mrs. Vance's elegant, sloping handwriting. I knew I shouldn't read it, but the unease had become a constant itch, and I needed an explanation for what I was experiencing. I opened it and began to read. It wasn't a diary. It was a log, a detailed, meticulous log of people. Their names, their habits, their favorite foods, the paths they walked every day. She wrote about her collection. "A moment is a fragile thing," she wrote on one page. "But once it is collected, it is preserved forever. They can never leave you then. They are a part of you." The entry that made my blood run cold was dated a month before I arrived. It was about me. My name, the time I'd shown up for the interview, the nervous way I'd folded my hands. It was all there. She had been watching me before I even stepped foot in the house. Panic, cold and nauseating, seized me. The quiet of the house, which had once felt so heavy, now felt like a living thing, like a predator holding its breath. I decided right then that I had to leave. I had to get out. As I raced down the hall to pack my things, I passed the locked door. The basement door. A sudden, terrible curiosity overcame my fear. I had to know. I had to see what was down there. I found the key she had left me on the kitchen counter, the one marked, emergency only. I didn't care. My hands shaking, I jammed it into the lock and turned. The door groaned open, revealing a stairwell leading into absolute darkness. The air was a blast of cold, and the sterile smell was stronger here. I turned on my phone's flashlight and descended, the light dancing on the concrete walls. The basement wasn't a storage room. It was a museum, a morbid, twisted gallery of her collection. There were mannequins in glass cases, dressed in clothing. But they weren't ordinary mannequins. Their faces were disturbingly lifelike, made of wax, their features eerily accurate to the faces in the stolen photographs on the wall. The hair on the heads was real. I shined my flashlight on the faces and felt a scream claw its way up my throat. I recognized them. A local man who had gone missing in the woods 10 years ago. A couple who had disappeared from their home a decade before that. A teenage girl from a neighboring town, whose case had been a mystery for years. And then I saw a case at the end of the room, still empty, waiting to be filled. My heart felt like a hammer against my ribs. My flashlight beam caught something else then, something on the wall behind the mannequins. There were several photographs, taken from a distance, of a young man walking down a street. My street. The photos were of me. And then I saw it. The most recent one. It was of me, sitting on the porch of the house a week ago, a book in my lap. I realized with a jolt of pure, gut-wrenching terror that she wasn't away on business. She was here. She had been here the whole time, in the attic, in the hidden passages I'd never found, watching me. Keeping her collection of my movements, my habits, my life. I scrambled back up the stairs, my legs weak with terror. I just had to get out, but as I reached the top step, I heard a faint click behind me. The sound of a lock turning. I spun around, my heart in my throat, and shined my flashlight into the darkness. At the bottom of the stairs, a small, dark shape stood motionless, a faint scent of lavender clinging to the air. Mrs. Vance's frail form, her face a pale mask in the darkness, her eyes twin pools of nothingness. I tried to run, but she was already turning off the light, plunging me into a black so absolute it felt like an embrace. The last thing I heard was the sound of her voice, thin and dry as a whisper, the sound of a key turning in a lock, and the soft rustle of her movements in the dark. It was the sound of a collector, finding the final piece to her collection. The sound of a life being preserved forever. The thing about a lie is that it's easiest to tell yourself one when the truth is too horrible to face. I've been telling myself a lie for months now. A lie that everything I experienced was just a product of a tired mind, a too active imagination. But tonight, the rain is drumming against my window, a frantic, rhythmic sound, and I can't pretend anymore. I need to get this down. I need someone to know. It started with a job posting. A summer gig as a live-in caregiver for an elderly man named Arthur. His family was paying a fortune to keep him out of a nursing home, and for me, a broke college student, it felt like winning the lottery. The job description was simple: cook, clean, and provide company. Easy money. The farm was miles from civilization, a forgotten pocket of the world. It was a beautiful place, in a desolate, forgotten kind of way, but there was an oppressive silence to it. The house itself was a museum of a life lived and lost, cluttered with dusty antiques and the lingering scent of mothballs and something else, something sweet and musty like old secrets. Arthur was a quiet man. His dementia wasn't what I expected. He was lucid, often, with eyes that held the clear, sharp intelligence of a man who had seen too much. But then, in the blink of an eye, a vacant look would settle over him, and he'd become a stranger in his own house. The strangest thing about him, though, was his obsession with the mirrors. Every single one in the house, from the grand gilded frames in the living room to the small, cracked vanity mirror in the upstairs hall was covered. They were all hidden behind old sheets, blankets, or newspaper. It was one of the first things he told me on my first day, his frail hand gripping my arm with surprising strength. "They have to be covered," he said, his voice a low, urgent rasp. "They have to be covered before the sun sets. Don't let the watcher in." I dismissed it as a symptom of his illness. I promised him I would follow his rules, of course. I just figured it was a harmless delusion, part of his fragmented reality. So every evening, just before the sun dipped below the horizon, I would go through the house, pulling the covers tighter over the glass. I'd find myself humming a little tune as I went, a mindless act to fill the silence. Arthur would watch me, his face a mask of profound relief, a tension I hadn't even realized was there draining from his body. But the quiet in the house was too loud. I started to notice things. A faint, almost imperceptible tapping sound that seemed to come from the walls. A whispering that would die on the air the moment I turned my head. And then there were the reflections. It sounds insane, I know. But sometimes, when I was passing one of the covered mirrors, I'd swear I saw a flicker of movement in my peripheral vision. Just a fleeting shadow, a distortion behind the fabric, that vanished the second I looked directly at it. I told myself it was my imagination, playing tricks on me in the isolated quiet of the house. I was tired, anxious, and alone. It made sense. But Arthur's anxiety was a contagious thing. He became more and more agitated as the days went on. He'd sit in his rocking chair, his eyes fixed on the covered mirrors, a low, constant murmur escaping his lips. "They're waiting," he'd whisper to the empty room. "They're just waiting for a chance." He'd check the locks on the doors, the windows, multiple times a night, his movements quick and desperate. One afternoon, I was cleaning out the attic when I found a box of old photographs and a collection of Arthur's personal effects. A shoebox filled with newspaper clippings, all about disappearances and unsolved missing persons cases from the area, spanning back decades. The clippings were all meticulously dated, and on the back of each one, Arthur had written a single word in his elegant, spidery script. Trapped. It gave me a terrible, chilling feeling, but I forced myself to ignore it. The fear, the real, soul-crushing fear, began on a Tuesday. The electricity went out, a sudden, complete blackness that swallowed the house. It was just before sunset. I fumbled for my phone, the flashlight beam a thin, useless spear against the overwhelming dark. I was in the living room, and I could hear Arthur's raspy, panicked breathing from his chair. The most terrifying sound, though, was the faint, muffled thud of the mirror covers falling to the floor. The blackout had caused a gust of air to stir, and in the sudden, complete silence, I heard the soft, sickening sound of cloth hitting wood. I shined my flashlight around the room, and in the dim light, I saw the great, ornate mirror above the fireplace, its surface gleaming, its reflection clear and unbroken. And there, standing behind me in the reflection, a tall, distorted figure with unnaturally long limbs and a head that seemed to sway side to side. It was a fleeting, nightmarish image, a terrifying blur that vanished as soon as I whipped around. There was nothing there, just the empty room. I had to get out. I grabbed my things, my mind a storm of panic and confusion. I knew I couldn't stay another minute. As I was about to leave, I saw an old, worn leather-bound journal on a small table near the front door. The cover was blank, but the title was etched into the first page, The Keeper's Log. It was Arthur's. I couldn't help myself. I had to know. I opened the journal and began to read. It wasn't about his life. It was a detailed, obsessive account of the Watchers, who lived inside the walls of the house. He wrote about them as if they were a known scientific fact, a species of parasitic entities that lived in the liminal spaces of old houses, in the gaps between the plaster and the lath. They were kept at bay by reflections. They could only travel through reflections, only exist in that strange, visual dimension. But they could also collect things. They could take people and trap them. The mirrors weren't a barrier. They were a prison. The covered mirrors were to keep them in. To keep them from getting out into the outside world. To keep them from taking anyone else. The final entry, scrawled in a frantic, almost illegible hand, was just a few days old. She's not strong enough. She doesn't understand. She'll let them out. She's the last one. My blood ran cold, and the air in the house suddenly felt thick and heavy. I looked at my own reflection in the glass of a bookcase. It wasn't me looking back. My reflection was twisted, distorted, and in the background a shadow moved. I dropped the journal and ran. I ran like a coward, like my life depended on it, out of the house and into the night. But as I stumbled through the darkness, I couldn't shake the image of that reflection. And I couldn't shake the horrifying thought of what I had just read. I had assumed all this time that Arthur was a victim of his own mind, that his fears were just a delusion. But he wasn't afraid of the reflections. He was terrified of what was behind them, of what was inside the walls. And he wasn't the victim. He was the keeper. I finally reached my car, fumbling with the keys, but before I could get in, I heard a sound that made me freeze. It wasn't a thump or a rustle. It was a soft, methodical tapping. It was coming from the side of the house, from one of the covered windows. I shined my flashlight and saw the glass of the window, its surface covered in a thin layer of condensation, and in the fog, a faint, almost invisible outline. It was a hand with long, slender fingers tapping on the glass. The hand was tapping on the inside of the window, and in the center of the hand's outline, a small, dark hole like a crack in the glass. I realized with a sudden, terrible certainty that the things that Arthur was so terrified of weren't in the mirrors. They were in the spaces between the mirrors, in the walls. They had been trapped, contained, but now I had uncovered them. I had let them see the outside world. And that's when I heard it, not from the house, but from inside the car. A faint, low whisper, like a key turning in a lock. A voice that sounded both far away and right next to me. "Thank you. You've freed us. I've been driving for hours, and the sound of the rain on my windshield has taken on a new rhythm. It's not the sound of water anymore. It's the sound of thousands of tiny, tapping fingers trying to get out." There's a smell I can't get out of my head. It's the scent of old paper, of dust that has settled for a century, of something dry and sweet, like a tomb. It's the smell of the library at the Finch estate, and it's the smell of my own fear. I'm an archivist, a freelancer who specializes in restoring and cataloging old documents. It's a quiet life, a solitary life, and I prefer it that way. When the offer came from a Mr. Elias Finch, I took it without hesitation. He was a reclusive, wealthy man who lived on a sprawling property on the far side of the state. He wanted me to work on a specific collection of journals left to him by an ancestor. The pay was exorbitant, and the instructions were simple. Work in the locked library in the main house, and do not, under any circumstances, leave the grounds. He would leave food and new instructions on the porch of the guest house where he lived. The main house was a grand, Gothic structure, more a mausoleum than a home. And the library was its heart. It was a vast room, with towering shelves that scraped the ceiling and a perpetual gloom that even the brightest lamps couldn't dispel. The air was thick and heavy, and it felt like it had been holding its breath for 100 years. The journals were in a small trunk in the center of the room. They were from the 19th century, their leather bindings cracked and their pages yellowed with age. They belonged to a woman named Beatrice, a relative of Mr. Finch. I started with the first one, my gloves carefully turning the delicate pages. The first few journals were a typical account of a young woman's life in the 1800s. Social events, family news, the simple rhythms of life on a grand estate. But as I went through the collection, the tone began to shift. The entries became shorter, more erratic. She started writing about a feeling of being watched, about a game of hide and seek she was forced to play. The whispers, she called them. She wrote about hearing them in the walls, in the floorboards. She wrote about their endless, silent demands. I'd be lying if I said it didn't unnerve me. I was alone in that house for weeks on end, and the more I read, the more I started to hear the things she described. The old house was a cacophony of creaks and groans, but I began to hear what sounded like a faint, rhythmic tapping from inside the walls. A soft, rustling sound that seemed to follow me as I walked. I told myself it was just the house settling, a product of my own tired mind and the oppressive isolation. But the sounds grew louder, more distinct. I'd be reading, and I would swear I could hear a faint, almost imperceptible whisper right behind my ear, a soft rustle, like old paper being rubbed together. Beatrice's journals became less about her life and more about the game she was playing with the whisperers. She believed they took things, and she wrote about hiding them. Old toys, a broken locket, a small, worn photograph. She meticulously described where she had hidden them, a strange, cryptic code of locations. Behind the eyes of the man in the painting, she wrote in one entry, "I found a loose panel behind a portrait in the hallway, and inside, a child's worn-out wooden soldier. My hands were shaking as I pulled it out. I started to find more. A tarnished silver locket behind a loose brick in the fireplace, a photograph tucked inside the hollow leg of a heavy desk. The more I found, the more I felt a desperate need to find them all, as if I could somehow right a terrible wrong. I felt like I was helping Beatrice, that her fears were not a delusion but a terrible truth, that she was trying to tell me something. The final journal was different. It was smaller, its cover blank and worn. The entries were a mix of frantic scrawling and clear, elegant handwriting. She wrote about a final game, the ultimate hiding place. She wrote that she had found a way to disappear something completely, to make it so the whisperers could never find it. The last entry was chilling in its simplicity. "I am gone," it read. "The collection is complete." Driven by a morbid curiosity, and by a growing, frantic sense of urgency, I set out to find the final hiding place. I worked through the cryptic clues in her final journal, and they all pointed to the same thing, the library itself, to a specific section of the wall behind the main bookshelf. I found a small, almost invisible seam in the old wood paneling. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely pry it open. It wasn't a secret drawer or a hidden compartment. It was a false wall. Behind it was a small, dark crawl space. I shone my flashlight inside, and a wave of cool, stale air washed over me, thick with the scent of dust and that same sweet, musty odor. And there it was. Not a hidden object, but something far more horrifying. A perfectly preserved, desiccated skeleton, still dressed in a crumbling wedding dress from the 19th century. A thin leather choker was still wrapped around its neck, a small, intricate locket attached to it. It was the same locket I had seen in a photograph of Beatrice. My stomach turned, and I stumbled backward, the flashlight beam dancing wildly. This wasn't a game. This wasn't a story of a woman trying to save lost objects. This was a grave, and the whisperers weren't a delusion. They were the victims. The missing people whose stories I had read about in newspaper clippings in the archives. Beatrice wasn't a victim. She was the one who had taken them. She was a killer. The journals weren't a plea for help. They were a confession, a twisted, meticulous log of a serial murderer. I backed away from the crawl space, my mind a storm of panic and disgust. I had to get out of this house. I had to get away from this terrifying discovery. But as I turned to run, my foot caught on a small, loose floorboard. I stumbled and fell, and my hand slid across the floor, scraping against a note that had been slipped under the heavy door of the library. It was from Mr. Finch. I read it, my blood turning to ice in my veins. "I hope you have enjoyed the journals," it read in a neat, careful script. "My family has always been a fan of the collection. We've been waiting for the right person to finish the catalog. The library is now locked from the outside. The collection is complete. You were the final piece." The last sentence wasn't written in ink. It was carved, etched into the wood of the floorboard itself, and as my fingers traced the letters, I realized they were not in Mr. Finch's handwriting, but in a delicate, elegant script I had come to know so well. Beatrice's. And then I heard it, a faint, soft tapping, a rhythmic whisper coming from inside the walls. And this time, I knew it wasn't my imagination. It was the sound of my own panic. The sound of a new collection, finally complete. I have to write this down. I don't know why. Maybe it's a desperate, final attempt to leave a breadcrumb trail. A way to prove that I was here, that this wasn't just a bad dream, that what's happening is real. I'm a third-year medical student, and all I wanted was a way to pay for my studies. The ad I saw on the university bulletin board was for a freelance transcriptionist for a retired doctor. It paid exceptionally well, and it seemed like a perfect fit. The doctor, a man named Alastair Finch, was a legend in his field, a specialist in rare neurological disorders who had retired years ago to a sprawling, dilapidated house on the outskirts of the city. He needed someone to transcribe his handwritten journals, a lifetime of research and patient files that he wanted to donate to a university. It felt like a golden opportunity. The house was a monument to a bygone era, with its grand, decaying facade and an air thick with the smell of old wood and neglect. But the real work was in the basement. It was a labyrinth of shelves, dusty and teeming with ancient files. Dr. Finch met me there, a frail man with a gentle face and eyes that seemed to hold a profound, distant sadness. He gave me my first set of journals and pointed to a small, rickety desk in the corner. "Just transcribe them," he said, his voice a low, raspy whisper. "And please stay out of the rest of the basement. It's just old patient files." I didn't question it. The pay was too good to be a stickler. For the first few weeks, the job was simple. I'd spend a few hours a day in the basement, The only sounds the tapping of my keyboard and the hum of the old fluorescent lights. The journals were fascinating. They weren't just patient files. They were a man's life work, his theories and obsessions laid bare on the page. Dr. Finch was obsessed with the concept of memory retention. He believed that traumatic memories weren't just psychological, they were physical, stored in the body, in the very cells and tissue. He wrote about a fluid he had developed, a concoction he believed could be used to extract these memories, to purge the mind of its greatest pains. It was all highly theoretical, the musings of a brilliant, if eccentric, mind. But the isolation and the constant gloom of the basement began to get to me. I started to hear things. Faint, rhythmic tapping sounds that seemed to come from the walls. A soft, rustling noise, like something was moving in the narrow spaces between the shelves. I told myself it was just rats, or the old house settling. But then one afternoon I heard it, a low, guttural groan, muffled and distant, that seemed to vibrate through the very floorboards. It was a sound of profound suffering, and it sent a cold spike of fear through my heart. I ran upstairs and found Dr. Finch sitting in his living room, staring out a window at the overgrown garden. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice trembling. He just turned to me, his eyes blank. "Hear what, my boy?" he asked. "The house is old. It makes noises." I tried to shake it off, but I couldn't. I started to pay closer attention to the journals, looking for any clue, any sign that what I was hearing was real. The later journals became more frantic, more obsessive. The handwriting was messy, almost illegible. He wrote about his experiments, not on rats or lab subjects, but on human beings. He wrote about his need to perfect the purging process, to remove the taint of trauma from a person's life. He described his subjects not as patients, but as specimens. And he wrote about the sounds. "The moaning is a good sign," he wrote in one entry. "It means the memory is fighting to stay. The tapping means it's trying to escape. I have to lock the memories in. I have to keep them contained." I finally found a small, hidden box in the corner of my desk. Inside was a syringe, tarnished and old, and a vial filled with a strange, dark fluid. The same fluid he wrote about in his journals. My hands were shaking as I held it. I had to know. I had to find a reason. I dug through the shelves, frantically searching for something, anything that would tell me what was happening. And I found it, a locked cabinet in the corner of the basement. I used a small screwdriver to pry the lock open, and inside, I found a series of files. They weren't about old, historical cases. They were about young men who had gone missing in the last few years, all from the local area. Photos, police reports, family statements. The last file was the most recent, dated just a month ago. A young man, a student from my own university. The photos were taken from a distance, of him walking across campus. They were all labeled Subject K. The truth, a cold and horrifying thing, came crashing down on me. Dr. Finch hadn't been transcribing old journals. He had been having me catalog his crimes. The patients were missing people, abducted, and brought to this house. The memory retention was a perverted, mad science. He wasn't purging them. He was keeping them. And the sounds, the tapping, the groans, they were real. I backed away from the cabinet, my heart a terrified drum against my ribs. I had to get out. I had to go to the police. But as I turned to run, my eyes fell on the last journal, the one I hadn't yet transcribed. The one on my desk, open to its last entry. The handwriting was recent, clear and legible. It was dated today. It spoke of a new specimen, one who was so close to perfection. It spoke of my hands, the way I so meticulously transcribed his life's work. It spoke of a final, necessary procedure, a purging of a particularly resilient set of memories that had been fighting to escape. And then, in a sudden, sickening flash of realization, I understood. The sounds, the tapping, the groans. The things I had heard in the house were not coming from outside the walls. They were coming from inside, and they were my own. They were the memories he had already taken. I was the specimen. I was already a part of his twisted collection. A voice, soft and calm, came from the top of the basement stairs. "There you are, my boy," Dr. Finch said, his voice as gentle as always. "I was just about to come down and let you know. The time has come for your final procedure. Don't worry, the process is painless. It's the only way to truly be free of your past." I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. I knew what he was holding, the tarnished syringe. And I knew, with a bone-deep certainty, that the memories he wanted to purge weren't just the traumatic ones. They were all of them. The memories of the job, of the old house, of the tapping, of my own life. And in the chilling silence of that basement, as I felt his presence behind me, I knew that the real horror wasn't death. It was the complete, utter erasure of everything I was. And as I stand here now, writing this, I can hear a soft, frantic tapping from inside the walls. My own memory, my own life, desperately fighting to escape. This is not a story I tell often. Not because I'm afraid to, but because no one ever believes it. They look at me with that polite, skeptical pity, the kind of look you give someone who has lost their mind. But I know what I saw. I know what I found. And the truth, the real, suffocating truth, is more terrifying than any ghost story. I'm an urban explorer. My world is made of abandoned places, forgotten corners of our history where time has stopped. I specialize in the deeply, profoundly derelict. The more untouched, the better. My friends and I had a kind of a holy grail, a legendary location that everyone had heard of but no one had ever found. An old, collapsed psychiatric hospital, rumored to be completely sealed off and untouched for 50 years. Its official name was the Rosewood Asylum, but we called it the Silent House. We heard rumors that it was a place of horrors, that the staff had conducted unspeakable experiments, and that one day, the entire West Wing had simply collapsed, burying its secrets and its patients in a single, final moment of silence. After months of digging, I found it, hidden deep in the woods, on an old, forgotten road. The front of the hospital was exactly as the stories said, a sprawling, imposing brick structure, its windows like vacant eyes staring out at the world. But the West Wing was a nightmare of twisted metal and jagged concrete, a tomb where the earth had swallowed the building whole. I went alone, of course. This was my find, my moment of triumph. The air was thick with the smell of rot and decay, a heavy, cloying scent that tasted of dust and old secrets. I found a small, gaping hole in the foundation and slid inside, my flashlight cutting a weak swath of light through the absolute darkness. The hospital was a living thing, breathing with a low, constant creak and groan. Dust motes danced in the single beam of my flashlight, and the silence was so profound it felt like a pressure against my eardrums. I was in a hallway, its walls covered in peeling paint and a strange, dark grime that I didn't want to think about. I passed old patient rooms, their doors ajar, their beds stripped and bare. I came across the files, and they were just as the stories said, piles of brittle, yellowed paper, their contents a heartbreaking record of suffering. I read about patients diagnosed with hysteria and moral insanity, and the treatments were terrifying: hydrotherapy, insulin coma therapy, and lobotomies. It felt like walking through a museum of human cruelty. Among the files, I found one that was different. It was a single, leather-bound journal. The patient's name was Clara. Her diagnosis was extreme human aversion. The journal was filled with her drawings, crude and childlike, but chillingly unsettling. They were all faces. Faces with no eyes. Faces with no mouths. Just a blank, smooth expanse of skin. I felt a cold knot of fear in my stomach. I carefully put the journal back, my hands trembling. The drawings stayed with me. They started to become all I could see in the shifting shadows of the hospital. And then I heard it. A faint, soft scratching sound, like a fingernail dragging against a stone wall. It was coming from deeper inside the hospital, from the direction of the collapsed wing. I told myself it was just rats, scurrying through the old pipes. But then I started to feel an unnerving coldness, a sudden, sharp drop in temperature that had nothing to do with the night air. And I felt a profound, terrible sense of being watched. I spent the next few hours documenting everything I could. The medical equipment, the rusty gurneys, the strange, archaic tools. I found a door that was slightly ajar, a door that, according to all the rumors, should have been sealed shut. I pushed it open and found myself in a different part of the hospital, a part that had miraculously survived the collapse. It was a single, long hallway, leading to a locked ward. The air here was colder, heavier, and the silence was deafening. I found a set of keys hanging on a hook, still gleaming. I unlocked the ward door and stepped inside. The ward was completely untouched. The beds were made, the nightstands were filled with personal belongings, and the air was thick with the scent of antiseptic and something else, something sweet and cloying like old flowers. And the walls were covered in drawings. The same crude faces from Clara's journal, but this time they were more detailed, more horrifying. Faces with eyes that wept black tears, mouths that were stretched into silent screams. The drawings covered every inch of the walls. It was a monument to her madness. I found Clara's room. It was different from the others. In the center of the room, on a small, rickety table, was a single, open file. It was a continuation of her journal. The last entries were different. They weren't drawings. They were written in a clear, lucid hand. She wrote about the doctors and their experiments. "They want to cure me of my aversion," she wrote. "They want to show me that faces are nothing to be afraid of. But I know the truth. They're just masks. The real face is behind them." The final entry was a chilling, desperate plea. I left a gift, a way to make them go away. The watcher is always there, behind the masks. I felt a sudden, profound sense of dread. My flashlight beam landed on a large, old trunk in the corner of the room. I opened it, and a smell of beeswax and chemicals hit me. Inside were masks. Not the kind you wear for a party. These were disturbingly lifelike, made of a hard, waxy material. They were disturbingly realistic. I picked one up, and its features were almost flawless. A man with a kind, gentle smile. But the eyes were just two empty holes. I put it down, my hands shaking. I needed to leave. I had to get out of this place. But as I turned to go, I saw a file I hadn't noticed before, tucked beneath the trunk. It was a recent file, with a date from a few days ago. The patient's name was my own. My heart hammered against my ribs as I opened it. It was a picture of me, taken from a distance, standing on the university campus. The file detailed my aversion to society and my unhealthy obsession with the past. It said that the best way to cure me was to put me in a place where the masks would be removed. A place where I could not leave until I understood the truth. I realized, with a soul-crushing certainty, that this wasn't an abandoned hospital. It was a private, experimental ward, a place that was still very much in business. And I wasn't an urban explorer. I was the newest patient. The doors to the ward slammed shut with a sickening thud, and a lock clicked into place. The air in the hallway grew cold, and a shadow fell over me. A voice, soft and calm, came from the end of the hall. "The doctor will be here soon," it said, its voice a low, raspy whisper. "You have so much to unlearn. We just have to make sure you're ready for the final treatment. The one where we take off the masks." I turned, and in the darkness, I could see a tall, gaunt figure. It was the same figure from Clara's drawings, a person with no face, its head a blank, smooth expanse. It was the Watcher, and I knew with a terrible, chilling certainty that the only thing worse than a ghost is a monster that's still alive. I need to tell this story. I have to. It's the only way I can think of to leave a record, to leave a mark. Because I have a feeling that soon, there won't be anything left of me. I'm a freelance IT technician. I'm used to strange jobs in strange places. But the call I got last month was in a league of its own. It was from a historical museum, tucked away in a remote corner of the countryside. The owner, a Mrs. Althea Finch, needed help with a legacy computer system. It was a custom-built, one-of-a-kind machine that controlled the museum's security and archival systems, and it had gone haywire. She offered an absurd amount of money, and I, being the eternally broke freelancer, took the bait. The museum was an old mansion, its exterior a beautiful, weathered testament to a bygone era. The air inside was thick with the scent of old wood, mothballs, and a subtle metallic odor that I couldn't place. Mrs. Finch was a wisp of a woman, her face a web of wrinkles, her hands trembling as she led me to the control room. It was a small, dusty office, overflowing with forgotten artifacts and personal effects. The computer was a relic, a massive, custom-built beast that hummed with a low, constant energy. "My family built it," she said, her voice a thin whisper. "It's the heart of our history. It just needs a little bit of care." She gave me the keys to the main house and left me to my work, telling me to stay in the guest house on the property and not to leave until I was done. For the first few days, the job was a fascinating puzzle. The system was a marvel of archaic engineering, its unique OS a challenge that I was eager to solve. I spent hours alone in the dusty office, the only sound the click of my keyboard and the soft, rhythmic hum of the machine. The house was unnervingly quiet, and I began to feel a profound sense of isolation. That's when I noticed the logs. The computer's system logs were meticulous, recording every single action, every file access, every keystroke. But some of the entries didn't make sense. The system was showing activity at odd hours, in the dead of the night, long after I had left for the day. I checked the external security logs, but they were pristine. No one had entered or exited the house. Driven by a growing sense of unease, I started digging deeper into the system. I found a hidden folder, its contents encrypted. It took me a full day to crack it, and when I did, I found something that made my blood run cold. It was a living history project, a massive archive of audio recordings and video files. But they weren't historical records of events. They were personal. They were clandestine recordings of conversations, arguments, and private moments between members of the Finch family, spanning back decades. The computer wasn't an archive. It was a surveillance system. Every room in that house was wired with hidden microphones and cameras, all feeding into this central machine. The Finch family had been spying on each other for generations. The metallic smell I couldn't place was the scent of old circuitry and wiring. My mind raced. What kind of family does this? I couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that something was profoundly wrong. I had to leave, but I had to know more. I couldn't help myself. I kept digging. I found a final folder, labeled Current Log. It contained a series of recent audio recordings, all from the last few months. They were of Mrs. Finch, talking to a man I assumed was her son. The conversations were a chilling mix of mundane and monstrous. She talked about his new girlfriend, whom she clearly despised, and the conversations were filled with a cold, detached malice. "She's not suitable for the legacy," she said in one recording. "She's a distraction. We have to follow the process." She spoke of the process as if it were a simple chore, a grim duty to the family's history. The son's voice was a low murmur, a passive instrument to his mother's will. Then I found it, an audio log from just last week. It was a conversation between Mrs. Finch and her son. She was giving him a list of instructions. "We monitor the subject," she said, her voice a flat, emotionless monotone. "We catalog their habits, their routines, their weaknesses. We lure them into the collection. And then we neutralize the threat. It's the only way to preserve our history." The word neutralize was used with a horrifying casualness. My hands were shaking as I listened, the blood draining from my face. I had been cataloging their history, their cold, murderous history. I had to get out. I ran from the office, the silence of the house no longer a quiet solitude, but a suffocating shroud of surveillance. I needed to get to my car. But as I ran through a long, dark hallway, I saw it. A small, almost invisible door tucked into the wall. A door that wasn't on the original blueprints. It was slightly ajar. I pushed it open, and the air that greeted me was thick with the scent of dust and something else, something sweet and cloying, like old flowers. It was a small, windowless room. But it wasn't empty. It was filled with personal effects. A woman's handbag, a man's car keys on a keychain, a wallet with a faded picture of a young couple. A series of small plaques were on the wall, each with a name and a date. And a chilling realization washed over me. These weren't museum pieces. These were the belongings of people who had gone missing from the area over the years. The Finch family wasn't just a collector of artifacts. They were collectors of people. I backed out of the room, my heart a terrified drum. I had to get away. I stumbled back to the control room, my mind screaming for me to leave, but my body frozen by a morbid, terrifying curiosity. I looked at the computer screen. The system logs were now showing a live camera feed. But it wasn't of the museum. It was of the guest house where I was staying. The camera was pointed at the front door. I could see myself in the reflection, my face a pale mask of terror. And then the camera shifted, just slightly, and a new screen appeared. It was a live feed of the guest house's living room. A new screen flashed, and a new message appeared. Access denied. You are now part of the collection. I looked back at my own face in the reflection of the computer screen. A small, cold smile was now on my face, a smile that wasn't my own. And from the darkness behind me, a voice, a whisper as thin as paper, came from a hidden speaker. "Welcome," it said, its voice a low melodic purr. "The collection is complete. You were the final piece. I am writing this now, sitting in the dark, the keyboard a faint source of light in the sea of shadow. The door to the office is locked. I can hear the soft, rhythmic hum of the machine, the humming of my own fear. There's a quiet that lives in the country. It's a silence that isn't empty, but full of things you don't want to hear. I know this now. I'm a graduate student, a wide-eyed historian in training, and all I've ever wanted to do was uncover the secrets of the past. The project I was helping Professor Thorne with seemed like a dream come true. He was a brilliant, reclusive academic, and his latest project was a historical mystery in a town called Havenwood. The town was a ghost on the map, with no official records, no mention in any census, just a single name on a few obscure old maps. It was a blank page, and we were going to write its history. I was excited. I was ready. I was so wrong. Havenwood was a town that time had forgotten. It was nestled deep in the woods, the trees so thick and oppressive they felt like a physical weight. The town itself was a collection of old, weathered houses, their windows like vacant eyes staring out at the world. The townspeople were a strange, silent lot. They didn't have cell phones or television. They kept to themselves, their faces blank, their eyes holding a deep, profound suspicion. Professor Thorne, a man with a wild beard and an air of perpetual melancholy, seemed to have an unspoken understanding with them. They gave us a small, rustic cabin to stay in and left us to our work. Our days were spent in the town's small, neglected library, a room thick with the smell of dust and old paper. The archives were a mess, a jumble of old documents, letters, and ledgers. We found fragments of a story, a dark history of isolation and strange, insular traditions. The most unsettling tradition was the sunset lock. Every night, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, the townspeople would go indoors, and their doors would be locked. The town would fall into a profound, unnatural silence that lasted until sunrise. We dismissed it as a quaint, if strange, tradition. The town was old. They had their ways. But then I found it, tucked away in a forgotten box of maps, a single, hand-drawn map of Havenwood. It was a marvel of meticulous detail, a piece of art drawn in a delicate, spidery script. It showed the houses, the streets, the roads leading in and out of the woods. But it showed something else, too. A series of intricate, winding lines that ran beneath the entire town, with tiny, labeled squares and circles. A vast, labyrinthine system of underground tunnels and chambers. And in the margins, scrawled in that same elegant hand, were a series of notes. The harvest, the collectors, the gift. The words sent a chill down my spine. This wasn't just a map. It was a secret history. I showed the map to Professor Thorne. His face, usually a mask of calm intelligence, went pale, his eyes wide with a look of pure, unadulterated terror. This is real," he whispered, his voice a low, raspy sound. He looked at me, his gaze holding a deep, profound sadness. He confessed that his family was from Havenwood, and his great-grandfather had fled the town in the dead of night, leaving everything behind. He was a historian, too, Professor Thorne said, his voice trembling. He was the one who drew this map. He was a defector. He tried to tell the world about this place, but no one would believe him. He spent the rest of his life as a pariah, haunted by what he saw. And I came here to prove him right, to find out the truth. The professor's confession filled me with a terrifying combination of fear and resolve. We had to find out. We had to see what was down there. That night, under the cover of the absolute darkness of the woods, we found a small, almost invisible hatch hidden beneath a pile of leaves, its iron handle cold and slick with dew. We pried it open and descended into the black. The air that greeted us was thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, something sweet and cloying, like a decaying flower. Our flashlights cut through the darkness, revealing a long, narrow tunnel, its walls slick with moisture. We followed it, our boots squelching in the mud, our hearts pounding against our ribs. The tunnels were a maze, leading to small, cramped chambers. We found them one by one, each one filled with a horrifying collection of artifacts. Not historical artifacts, but personal items. A man's wallet, a child's worn-out teddy bear, a woman's car keys, their key ring jangling against the cold metal walls. They were the belongings of people who had gone missing from the area over the years, the quiet, unsolved cases that had haunted the local news for decades. We stood there, our flashlights dancing on the macabre collection, and the horrifying truth, a cold and monstrous thing, settled over us. This wasn't a town. It was a trap. The harvest wasn't a crop. It was a ritual. The townspeople were not a community. They were a cult of killers, and the tunnels were a tomb. We had to get out. We turned, our feet splashing in the mud, but from the darkness behind us we heard it. A whisper, a low, slithering sound. The sound of dozens of boots on the damp earth. The sound of the townspeople, the collectors, coming for us. We were trapped, and that's when Professor Thorne stopped. He turned to me, his face a pale mask in the darkness, and his eyes, a familiar shade of green, held a terrifying, knowing sadness. "The map," he whispered, his voice a low, melodic purr. He didn't draw this to save people. He drew it to keep the tradition alive. He was a collector, too. He was the one who started the harvest. He was supposed to return one day and bring a gift to the town. He was supposed to fulfill his destiny. He pulled a small, old-fashioned knife from his belt. It glinted in the dim light of our flashlights. "My project wasn't about documenting the past," he said, a horrifying smile spreading across his face. "It was about fulfilling my birthright. about bringing them a new gift. My mind screamed. My blood turned to ice. It wasn't the silent, unblinking townspeople I had to fear. It was the man I had trusted, the man who had lured me here, the man who had betrayed me. "I'm so sorry," he said, his voice as gentle as a parent. "I told them you'd be perfect. I told them you were a blank page, just waiting to have your story written. I'm sorry. This is for the harvest." And as the sound of the townspeople's footsteps grew closer, as the professor raised his knife, I knew that the true horror wasn't in the darkness of the tunnels. It was in the face of the man who smiled at me, the face of the one who had finally completed his family's collection. There's a quiet that lives in the country. It's a silence that isn't empty, but full of things you don't want to hear. I know this now. I'm a graduate student, a wide-eyed historian in training, and all I've ever wanted to do was uncover the secrets of the past. The project I was helping Professor Thorne with seemed like a dream come true. He was a brilliant, reclusive academic, and his latest project was a historical mystery in a town called Havenwood. The town was a ghost on the map, with no official records, no mention in any census, just a single name on a few obscure old maps. It was a blank page, and we were going to write its history. I was excited. I was ready. I was so wrong. Havenwood was a town that time had forgotten. It was nestled deep in the woods, the trees so thick and oppressive they felt like a physical weight. The town itself was a collection of old, weathered houses, their windows like vacant eyes staring out at the world. The townspeople were a strange, silent lot. They didn't have cell phones or television. They kept to themselves, their faces blank, their eyes holding a deep, profound suspicion. Professor Thorne, a man with a wild beard and an air of perpetual melancholy, seemed to have an unspoken understanding with them. They gave us a small, rustic cabin to stay in and left us to our work. Our days were spent in the town's small, neglected library, a room thick with the scent of dust and old paper. The archives were a mess, a jumble of old documents, letters, and ledgers. We found fragments of a story, a dark history of isolation and strange, insular traditions. The most unsettling tradition was the sunset lock. Every night, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, the townspeople would go indoors, and their doors would be locked. The town would fall into a profound, unnatural silence that lasted until sunrise. We dismissed it as a quaint, if strange, tradition. The town was old. They had their ways. But then I found it, tucked away in a forgotten box of maps, a single hand-drawn map of Havenwood. It was a marvel of meticulous detail, a piece of art drawn in a delicate, spidery script. It showed the houses, the streets, the roads leading in and out of the woods. But it showed something else, too. A series of intricate, winding lines that ran beneath the entire town, with tiny labeled squares and circles. A vast, labyrinthine system of underground tunnels and chambers. And in the margins, scrawled in that same elegant hand, were a series of notes. The harvest, the collectors, the gift. The words sent a chill down my spine. This wasn't just a map. It was a secret history. I showed the map to Professor Thorne. His face, usually a mask of calm intelligence, went pale, his eyes wide with a look of pure, unadulterated terror. This is real," he whispered, his voice a low, raspy sound. He looked at me, his gaze holding a deep, profound sadness. He confessed that his family was from Havenwood, and his great-grandfather had fled the town in the dead of night, leaving everything behind. He was a historian, too, Professor Thorne said, his voice trembling. He was the one who drew this map. He was a defector. He tried to tell the world about this place, but no one would believe him. He spent the rest of his life as a pariah, haunted by what he saw. And I came here to prove him right, to find out the truth. The professor's confession filled me with a terrifying combination of fear and resolve. We had to find out. We had to see what was down there. That night, under the cover of the absolute darkness of the woods, we found a small, almost invisible hatch hidden beneath a pile of leaves, its iron handle cold and slick with dew. We pried it open and descended into the black. The air that greeted us was thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, something sweet and cloying, like a decaying flower. Our flashlights cut through the darkness, revealing a long, narrow tunnel, its walls slick with moisture. We followed it, our boots squelching in the mud, our hearts pounding against our ribs. The tunnels were a maze, leading to small, cramped chambers. We found them one by one, each one filled with a horrifying collection of artifacts. Not historical artifacts. but personal items. A man's wallet, a child's worn-out teddy bear, a woman's car keys, their key ring jangling against the cold metal walls. They were the belongings of people who had gone missing from the area over the years, the quiet, unsolved cases that had haunted the local news for decades. We stood there, our flashlights dancing on the macabre collection, and the horrifying truth, a cold and monstrous thing, settled over us. This wasn't a town. It was a trap. The harvest wasn't a crop. It was a ritual. The townspeople were not a community. They were a cult of killers, and the tunnels were a tomb. We had to get out. We turned, our feet splashing in the mud, but from the darkness behind us we heard it. A whisper, a low, slithering sound. The sound of dozens of boots on the damp earth. The sound of the townspeople, the collectors, coming for us. We were trapped, and that's when Professor Thorne stopped. He turned to me, his face a pale mask in the darkness, and his eyes, a familiar shade of green, held a terrifying, knowing sadness. "The map," he whispered, his voice a low, melodic purr. He didn't draw this to save people. He drew it to keep the tradition alive. He was a collector, too. He was the one who started the harvest. He was supposed to return one day and bring a gift to the town. He was supposed to fulfill his destiny. He pulled a small, old-fashioned knife from his belt. It glinted in the dim light of our flashlights. "My project wasn't about documenting the past," he said, a horrifying smile spreading across his face. "It was about fulfilling my birthright, about bringing them a new gift." My mind screamed. My blood turned to ice. It wasn't the silent, unblinking townspeople I had to fear. It was the man I had trusted, the man who had lured me here, the man who had betrayed me. "I'm so sorry," he said, his voice as gentle as a parent. "I told them you'd be perfect. I told them you were a blank page, just waiting to have your story written. I'm sorry. This is for the harvest." And as the sound of the townspeople's footsteps grew closer, as the professor raised his knife, I knew that the true horror wasn't in the darkness of the tunnels. It was in the face of the man who smiled at me, the face of the one who had finally completed his family's collection.